Hi, welcome back. Glad you could join me today. Today I thought we'd do a fantastic little painting, maybe it's deep in the woods and it's very dark and misty, and I think you'll enjoy that. So let's start out and have them graphically run all the colors across the screen that you need to paint along with me, and they'll come across in the same order as I have them on the palette, starting with the white and working around. While they're doing that, let's go on up here. I have the good old standard 18 by 24 inch canvas, and I've already covered.
Hey, it's Buttons. Bob Ross has been a major inspiration on my artistic journey for many years, so I wanted to do a tribute to his unique style while also incorporating my love of Elden Ring and FromSoft games. I hope you enjoy this Artist Hour presentation at the Coffee House. The first thing I'm doing here is I have a folder of some photos that I'll be using to help make this canvas. There are 3 different photos of Liurnia or Raya Lucaria. I started off making a 4K canvas. I already had those photos in a folder, and I'm going to take one of those folders. I'm going to take one of those photos from that folder, and I'm going to flip it upside down. I'm going to stretch the photo to put the mist line around the upper third, maybe the middle of the canvas to the upper third. To do that, I'm just using this mesh transform and dragging the control points around. I'm going to try as best as I can to get that mist line around where I want and to be fairly level. I'm going to have to drag these other corners here on the right side a little bit further down in order to get that level. I think that's looking good enough. Maybe this side can come down a little bit. In order to fix this part in the top here, I'm just going to lasso select some of this, copy some of it over, cover that up. We can use our blur tool to blend that in. And I'm going to run a really strong Gaussian blur here. Strength around 130. And it's just going to blur everything. And we're going to make a new layer on top of this. This is where I'm going to do some painting. Got my eyedropper tool. And I'm just going to grab a color from the bottom to use as the blue water. And I'm just going to harmonize a lot of the colors down here. Sort of bring them all together to be about the same. We don't need a whole lot of detail to show through. I realized a little bit too late that I was painting on the wrong layer. Classic mistake, but just hit undo a bunch of times and then go to the right layer. And I've got this dark color that I sampled from those dark shapes in the upper left, and I'm just gonna airbrush across the center to turn that bright mist into some distant shadow. And the next thing we can do is take that same color and use maybe a bit of a harder edge, stronger airbrush to paint in these silhouettes of what look like some tree shapes. You can play around with your brush settings if you need in order to get it the right strength level that you want. I usually like to have it to where I only need to make one pen stroke in order to get the right density that I'm looking for. Don't think I was using a very dark enough color, so I resampled some color off of the canvas there to get something a little darker. And now these look like a bunch of blurry, distant tree shapes. I don't think they're blending quite well enough into the ground, so I went over that distant shadow a little bit more to help them blend together. Next thing I'm going to do here is make a folder called Tree Shapes. And in this folder, I'm going to be dropping some shapes of trees. And these tree shapes are going to serve as another layer. So this has to do with layering stuff to create depth. So we're going to start off with a couple of these tree shapes here. I want the leaves on them to go off the top of the canvas. It sort of helps to create a bit of, feels like they're set more into the environment. A little bit more realistic of them going off the top of the canvas. And I've changed the color of them to match a darker color of what you can see on the canvas. So you can just sample a color and then change all the colors on the layer you're editing to the color that you have picked up. Then from there, I created a mask and I erased the bottoms of the trees, which sort of helps to put them into the ground. It looks like they're rising out of some bit of mist or darkness or some combination of the two. And the thing I'm doing right now is just adding a bit of these creepy branch shapes. You don't really need to mess with their colors too much. I think leaving them at this really dark color, basically black, is going to be good enough. And we'll do the same thing to them that we did to the trees by creating a mask and soft erasing the bottom of the branches. I've created another layer and I've put that layer behind the first trees that we threw down. And just going to be adding a couple more tree shapes here. Don't want them to look the exact same. So I'm going to mess with one of them here. Stretch it out. Flip it around. And I don't want it to cover up too much of those creepy branches coming out of the ground. So I've put it off to the side a bit. And the color I'm going to grab to turn these trees into is going to be a lighter color than the first trees that we put down, but also needs to be darker than the color we see off in the distance in order to help show the silhouettes of those trees. Alright, I'm going to make a new folder called Crystal. And another folder inside that one called Crystal Mask. We're going to draw the shape of a crystal using the polyline select. I'm just drawing the area of the crystal that we're going to be drawing within using the lasso, just so I have an idea about how big it's going to be, because that felt about the right size. And we can use this polyline tool to just start dropping in these points. The select tools can be a little finicky. Definitely play around with them. I learned that if you tap too quickly to add these anchor points, then the iPad might assume that you are double tapping to say you are done placing control points. Meant to say control points, not anchor points. But yes, I'm just going to add some crystal shapes. They generally look like this, I think. We're going to add a base. It's going to look just as jagged as the crystal shapes. Definitely wanted to have that big crystal shape surrounded by little crystal shapes. And once you have your selection like this, I'm going to create a mask of it on the crystal mask folder. Didn't want to do that just yet, actually. I felt like it needed to be moved, but I can't move the selection. So what I did was I just bucket filled the area of the crystal and then moved whatever that shape was. And then I selected the area of that shape that I moved. And then I created the mask on the folder crystal mask. Gonna take this photo here and we're gonna use this for the crystal. I'm gonna drop that right into the crystal mask folder. And we can stretch this really, really thin and just fit it to the angle that this crystal is at. I can use these vertical lines of these stone pillars to help orient the shape of that photo to the shape of the crystal. And the same goes for the little crystals on the side too. Just gonna make duplicates of that photo, change the angle, stretch it around a little bit just to get it lined up. And then something we can do here is merge those layers together of all the photos, and we can run a Gaussian blur. Don't want to show too much of that original detail. We need to get rid of as much of it as possible, but still keep the colors. Something we can do now is I created a layer and put that layer above the crystal mask folder. and then I go back to the crystal mask folder, right click it, and create selection based on that folder. And you can see it has an outline now. Then you can go to edit and outline selection, and that will let you just throw down an outline. And then within that outline, we can start adding some lines to represent the faces of the crystals. And to make that easy, we can use the figure tool to draw straight lines. I don't need to get too fancy with this. I'm just making these Y shapes. Maybe a little bit of variation here and there. Little chips in the crystals. Now the lines don't have to connect all the way to the bottom. And that's because we're going to mask out the bottom. Just making these Y shapes for the most part. I think that looks good enough. Something we can do now is create another layer. We're going to keep it in the crystal folder, but make it below the crystal mask layer. On this layer, we can add a bit of glow. I've grabbed this really bright blue cyan color, and just using an airbrush, we can paint in behind this crystal, and it adds this nice glow effect. We don't want too much glow, or it'll stand out way too much. Then we can make a layer mask on the crystal folder and then just soft erase the bottom. And that helps to set it into the environment. We can grab the folder and move it around, just get it to exactly where we want. Next thing I want to do is do some detailing of the water. I've made a new folder above the crystal folder, called it water. And we can go to the crystal folder, right click it and select convert layer to raster. Now that won't get rid of the crystal folder, but it will create a duplicate layer of everything in that folder on a raster layer. And we can take that new layer, that new duplicate layer, and we can move it up into this folder for water. And then we can apply a motion blur to it. And I set the angle of the motion blur to, it could be 0 degrees or 180 degrees, as long as it's going from left to right. And strength maybe around 17. And then you just reduce the opacity to maybe about 33%. And you've got a nice reflection of the crystal on the water. This next part I'm doing is I've made another layer just above that crystal reflection. And I have these vague shapes of water on the surface that I'm just going to stamp down, modify a little bit. You can do things like add variations, such as flipping it around horizontally. You can stretch it out using the free transform tool. And a principle that I like to keep in mind as often as possible is surface compression. What that means is things that are closer to the camera, you kind of see more normally, but the farther those things get away from the camera, the more they get squashed. So the farther out into the distance you go. Now all I'm really concerned with right here is placing these shapes down to get I just want them to look like how the water will look ultimately. This is not going to be the final version of the water. We just want the shapes to go roughly where the water will go, and you'll see what I mean. I don't want it to look too much like we're just using the same stamp over and over again. So I've tried to add as much variation as possible, like doubling them up, putting them next to each other, having them overlap, cascade them. And I think this looks good enough from where we are. So now we're going to create a selection based on the contents of that layer. You can hide the marching ants. You can hide the original layer. I've made a new layer on top, and with a soft airbrush we can go in and we can start to reveal the shapes that we put down. You can work out from the center since that's the brightest spot near the crystal. You can add more strokes, more pen strokes to that area. Don't see enough of the shapes. Just going to go over that a little bit more. Maybe that's a bit too much. Definitely feel this out a little bit. If you don't think you see enough of the water, definitely go over it again. I usually err on the side of less is more, so I try to get away with as little as possible. Next, I've made a new layer on top of those water shapes that we just painted in. I'm going to grab some kind of cloud gray, like gray with a little bit of blue in it. And I'm going to use an airbrush tool here to add in a little bit of fog on top of the water. I want this fog to surround the crystal and work I want it to work in cascading shapes. I made straight lines going towards or away from the crystal, and then I added a little bit of circular motions to add a little bit of puffiness to the fog clouds. Alright, I think that about does it for the water. Next up is the light rays. I've made a folder on top of the water folder called light rays. And just inside of here, I'm going to get a little bit of a yellow, orange, gold color. And I'm just going to grab some soft watercolor brush here. And I can go to the upper left and start dotting in these little dapples of light. Want to add some space in between the blotches of light in the corner. And I'm just going to draw these lines starting from the upper corner and pointing down in the direction of the crystal. And I want them to be as parallel as possible. I don't want them to be going in different directions. Because the thing we're going to do with these light rays is we're going to stretch them out. We can go up to blur and do a motion blur. Want the direction to go in one direction, so I set that to forward. We're going to put the angle at around 22 and max out the strength at 100. That looks good. And we can just run the same effect. Motion blur again. Motion blur again. And we can keep going until the light rays are just about to touch the crystal. And then we can lower the opacity of that layer down to maybe about 30-ish%, just until you can see the silhouettes of the trees behind the light rays. I think that does it for the light rays. So now we're going to work on a midground tree. It's going to go in front of the crystal. And to get the shape of this tree, I just grabbed my lasso tool and I'm going to freehand the silhouette of this tree. It's not going to be anything crazy. It's going to have a decently strong base to the tree. And it's going to lean a little bit towards the direction of the crystal. A benefit you get from using the lasso tool for this, at least for me, is that the stabilization is really low. And that means you're going to get a lot of imperfections in your line. And those imperfections look really natural. So once I have my selection, I apply that selection as a layer mask to the folder we created, the midground tree folder. And then the thing we can do here is grab this third photo, and we're going to stretch this photo to make it fit to the shape of the tree. It's got a lot of good colors in it that we can use for colors on the tree. What works out is it has darker colors near the bottom of the photo. And it also has a lot of natural colors already in it, like the browns from the ruins and the greens from the trees. In order to help get the shape adjusted to about where our tree outline is, I moved the photo outside of the folder group so we can see everywhere the photo is, so none of it gets masked out. And then I lowered the opacity so that when I use the mesh transform, I can see that the edges are just going up to fill the tree area. I want to get as much usage out of the space this photo takes up as possible. So then I move the photo back into that folder, and then we can run a really heavy Gaussian blur on it. Just get rid of as much of that detail as possible. Maybe about near 130 strength. From here, we can grab some colors that we'll use to paint in the tree. I've made a new layer on top of the photo layer where we'll be doing the painting. And the first thing I want to do is level out the colors on this tree and make it fairly dark. The idea here is I'm going to add light to this dark colored tree. And I think I'll use the right side of the tree for more green, mossy colors, and the left side of the tree will be more for the light from this light source coming from off the canvas. It'll be hitting that warm brown color. And one of the things I'm going to do here is take a dark color and start adding in these strokes that go in between the lighter colors like the greens and the browns in order to add some little bit of texture to the basic color we've laid out for this tree. Something I want to add here is a little knot in the tree. I think to do that we're going to get a really dark color and then draw this line following the shape of the tree. Adds a little bit of interest to it. Maybe there's a creature or something that lives in there. Hey, it's Buttons. If you're enjoying the video so far, like and subscribe to the channel. Okay, bye. Alright, the next thing I'm going to do is create a folder inside this tree folder. And I'm going to call it tree detail. We can make a new layer inside that folder. And I'm going to start dropping down some shapes that look a little bit like tree bark. I can adjust these shapes to fit the overall shape and direction of the tree we're working with. Using a mesh transform here, I can squish a little bit of this detail near the edge of the tree to make it seem a little more three-dimensional. make it actually seem round. Not going to use too many shapes for this, maybe about 4. The shape right here would go really well on the lower right part of the tree. Gonna flip it horizontal. I think that would work better. And from here I can see about doing a mesh transform and try to fit the shape of this roughly to this edge of the tree. Again, I'm going to squish the detail of this shape near the edge of the tree. I think that helps give it a more three-dimensional feel. Alright, and I think that about does it for putting down these shapes on the tree. We're going to use the same technique that we used for the water. Just before we do that though, I've made a new layer that I'm going to use as a color palette. And I'm going to pick some colors from this photo, and I'm going to use those for our little palette. I picked up a color from the shrub, a nice brown color from these ruins, some medium green from the tree, looking for a good dark green, something in the shadow, but not something too dark. I think that seems good. And I just grabbed one more bit of green near where the Erd tree is reflecting off the top of the leaves. And so now we've got some colors we can use to paint in to these shapes on this tree. I'm going to set that aside so I can quickly reference it with my eyedropper tool. And if you're wondering how I did the outlines to those colors that I drew down, there is a window called layer property which you can make visible, and in that layer property window you can turn on borders for the selected layer, which will automatically create a border around everything on that layer. So I've selected all the shapes that I put on this tree and then hid the marching ants of that selection. I've made a new layer on top of the tree, and I'm just going to grab colors from this color palette that we made and paint onto the tree. And generally what I'm looking at is adding lighter colors onto darker areas and darker colors onto lighter areas. And I also want to make sure the colors are not getting mixed up too much. So I'm generally going to be using more earthy brown colors on the left side and more cool green colors on the right side. Just seeing how I might be able to use this brighter color I picked up, since this side of the tree is going to be getting hit by these light rays, or at least reflecting some of the light. I think that's good enough for now. So I've made a new layer on top of that, and before I continue, I really felt like this side of the tree could get lit up a little bit more due to the light rays we added in. So on another layer, I'm going to be adding in some lines on this tree to represent a little bit of the bark detail. I just got a color that's pretty close to black. I don't want the pen size to be too big or too small, so I got something that's fairly small enough, maybe about 4-point size, and I'm just making some lines to trace the shape of the tree, the 3D feeling of this tree. And these kinds of lines show up better on more well-lit areas, so you don't have to add them in everywhere. And you don't need a whole lot of them either. Just need some lines to represent detail. And you only really need them in the place that people will see them. And again, trees are very organic things, so you don't need to have a lot of stabilization to your pen when you make these lines. Next, I'm going to sample a color from this crystal, and on another layer with a soft airbrush, I'm just going to add in some glow on this tree. Alright, I think that about does it for the tree. Now we can add in some foliage. So I've made a new folder, midground foliage. We're going to add some shapes to this tree. I've got this same tree shape we've used already, but we're going to get as much usage out of it as we can. I'm going to stick it just up here off of this little branch that I added to the tree. Gonna change it, make it a little bit more vertically oriented. I think it looked a little bit too much like it was just jutting off from the tree, off in some straight line direction. I want it to look a little more organic than that, so I want there to be a turn coming off of the branch. So I sampled the color on the end of this branch and then turned our tree shape into that color. Then we can just mask out the bottom, and it looks like it's fit right onto the end of that branch. Next, I'm going to use this other tree shape here to add a little bit of foliage growth on this tree. We only need part of it, so I've placed it here. I've added a layer mask, and I'm going to soft erase the bottom away just enough to the point that we get the idea across. And again, we can use the same technique of just changing the color of the shape to match whatever dark color or color is at the base of wherever it touches, so that it melts into whatever shape it is coming out of better. Got this other tree shape here that we can turn on its side and use as some foliage coming from in front of the tree. I don't want it to block that hole that we drew in the tree, so I'm going to make sure there's a bit of an opening there. And we could use one more shape in the lower left. And we're going to get as much usage out of this tree shape as possible. So, going to add that right there. And then I'm going to soft erase away a little bit of that first shape because it had a hard edge that I don't want to show up. And now we've got some foliage down near the front. we can convert the color of these shapes to not be pure black. I've made them a very, very dark blue-green color. Then I've got this little custom foliage brush. It's good for adding little bits of detail. And we're going to add a bit of highlight to these pieces of foliage. So I've made a new layer. I've got the color palette back up. I've sampled some of the colors from it. And I'm just going to use that foliage brush to paint in over those shapes to add highlight coming from our light sources. And we've got this vibrant light coming from the left, which should help bring out the natural color of the foliage. So I'm using this green color on the left side of the foliage to help highlight those colors. I've grabbed that lighter color and I'm going in and seeing how much I can get away with using that to add an even lighter color to our highlights. Next, I'm going to sample a color from the crystal and use that as a highlight color for our foliage over here. Since that foliage is not getting hit by the light rays coming from the left, and is more likely to get hit by the light coming from the crystal we have drawn. We can even add a little bit of foliage to We can even add a little bit of highlight to the foliage we put on top of the tree. All right, and with that foliage done, we can work on just another layer of depth here on the right side of the canvas. We can add in this shape for a tree, another tree shape. And this is going to be the closest layer to the camera. And something you might notice is that things tend to get darker the closer they get to the camera. So for this tree shape, I'm really just using black. It is a pure silhouette. I use that foliage brush to add to that silhouette. And something I'm doing here is just seeing if other shapes work. And you know, this tree shape that I just used works so well that I think we can get away with using it again. So I'm just going to add it to this spot and make it look like it is a branch coming off from that tree. Gonna go in and add some final details here. I think we could add some glow from those crystals onto this tree silhouette in the foreground. I use a soft airbrush for that, just along the edge, and then I can erase bits from that soft airbrush right around where those branches are, to make it look like the light from the crystal is being blocked by the branches. Don't want too much of that glow. Like I said before, you can have too much of the glow, and I like to get away with as little as possible, so I erased a little bit of it. There are a couple of things about this tree that I want to change. The first thing is that I think this knot in the tree, this hole, could be a little bit darker because it didn't stand out very much. So I've just got a very dark color and I've gone over it again. And something else that caught my eye to add are fireflies. So I've made a new folder called fireflies. And then on a new layer in this folder, I'm going to take this roughly medium blue color, and I'm going to start dotting in these little oval shapes to represent fireflies. Now on the foreground tree, they're going to be as big as they get. Then I shrunk the brush down to get the fireflies on the midground tree here. I don't want too many fireflies, but I do want them to seem like there are a lot of them. Alright, now it's time to make these fireflies glow. I've added a new layer on top and changed the blending mode to add glow. And using that same blue color, I'm going to softly airbrush over top of these fireflies. Now, because these are closer to the camera, I wanted to add the glow by hand, but for these distant fireflies we drew, I can just right-click the original fireflies layer where their bodies are and create selection from it. And then I can subtract select the ones in the foreground just to make sure that I only have the ones in the background selected. And then I can fill the space of that on the add glow layer with the color we were using, and then apply a Gaussian blur, just enough to get that little bit of glow around them. Back to our midground tree here. The other thing, back to our midground tree here. The other thing that I wanted to do is I've made a new layer. And I've changed the blending mode to color dodge. And I've grabbed this bright gold color that we were using for the light rays. And I'm just going to softly airbrush on the left side of this tree to get that nice light rays color. Alright, I think this one's about done. Just gonna sign it. And I think that'll be about it.